The news broke like a thunderclap on a quiet Monday morning. The headlines across major networks erupted with a single, seismic announcement. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez files defamation lawsuit against Senator John Kennedy. The nation froze. Twitter exploded. Commentators scrambled for airtime. In an era where political feuds often play out on cable news or Twitter threads, this was something different. This was official, legal, historic. According to AOC's legal team, Kennedy had crossed the line. In a fiery town hall weeks earlier, accusing her of weaponizing emotion over evidence during a heated budget hearing. But that wasn't all. In a separate interview, he referenced her past activism with a statement that, to her team, wasn't just offensive, was defamatory. AOC, standing in front of a row of cameras, declared, "This isn't just about me. It's about every woman who's been dismissed, disrespected, and degraded by men in power trying to silence us." The crowd behind her roared. Applause broke out. For her supporters, this was a reckoning. But Senator Kennedy? He barely flinched. He emerged from the Capitol later that day, jacket slung over his shoulder, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, said only this: "She picked the wrong fight. I come to court with facts, not feelings." That one. Quote, made the rounds faster than wildfire. Meme pages lit up. Talk shows dissected it. Some called it arrogant. Others called it calculated. But everyone agreed this wasn't going to be an ordinary trial. And yet, behind the scenes, something was brewing that no reporter had yet uncovered. Kennedy's legal team wasn't just preparing a defense. They were assembling a witness list. And on it was a single name circled in red, someone who knew AOC not from Capitol Hill, but from years earlier, long before the media spotlight, before Congress, even before the fame. Someone who had nothing to lose and every reason to speak. The media didn't know it yet, neither did the public. But this witness, quiet, unassuming, forgotten, was about to change everything. And when the courtroom doors finally opened, the entire country would understand why Kennedy had stayed so calm. Because one person, just one, was about to speak. 9 seconds of truth that would shake AOC's legacy to its core. The morning of the first hearing felt more like a movie premiere than a civil trial. Camera crews swarmed the courthouse steps. Protesters and supporters lined opposite sides of the street, one side waving "Stand" with AOC signs, the other holding posters with phrases like "Facts over fame" and "Kennedy doesn't flinch." Inside the courtroom, the air buzzed. With anticipation, reporters jostled for seats. Staffers from both offices, AOC's and Kennedy's, sat stiff-backed in the gallery. Notebooks ready, eyes sharp. The bailiff called the room to order. And then she walked in. AOC entered, flanked by her lawyers, poised and prepared. She wore a white suit that seemed to signal purity, strength, and righteousness all at once. The courtroom fell silent as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table. Moments later, the doors opened again and in strolled Senator John Kennedy. He didn't bring the fire and brimstone you'd expect from his Senate speeches. No grand gestures, no smirks. He looked calm. Cool, almost casual, as if this wasn't the courtroom showdown half the nation was tuning in for. He nodded respectfully to the judge, then turned and made brief eye contact with AOC. No hostility, just something subtle. A message. Let's dance. The judge read out the charges: defamation, reputational damage, professional harm. Then the attorneys dove into opening statements. AOC's lead counsel didn't hold back. He painted a picture of a woman dedicated to truth and service, vilified by a senior senator simply because she challenged the status quo. He quoted Kennedy's interviews, played clips from C-SPAN, and laid out a timeline of media damage. "This isn't disagreement," he said, voice rising. "It's destruction. We will prove that intent." The courtroom nodded in agreement. Then, Kennedy's lawyer, Roseanne, older man with a slow southern drawl that seemed to echo Kennedy's own. His approach? Surgical. He didn't deny Kennedy said what he said. He didn't apologize either. Instead, he turned the argument on its head. "We'll show you that what Senator Kennedy said wasn't an attack, it was a reflection. A reflection of patterns, statements, and actions that this courtroom will find troubling. And just like that, the tone shifted. The jury didn't just have to decide whether Kennedy defamed AOC now. They had to question whether her public image could withstand a deeper look. And as Kennedy's legal team quietly filed a sealed witness list with the court, one name on that list remained unknown to the public but was about to become unforgettable. By the third day of the trial, the headlines had reached fever pitch. Cable news aired live analysis between witness testimonies. TikTok was flooded with hot takes and conspiracy theories. On Capitol Hill, whispers ran wild about who Kennedy's surprise witness might be. But inside the courtroom, things remained tightly controlled. AOC's team brought in one ally after another, colleagues from Congress, media analysts, and even a behavioral expert who argued Kennedy's remarks carried undeniable gender bias. Each witness painted AOC as the victim of an intentional campaign meant to undermine her credibility. The jury leaned in. The courtroom sympathized. Kennedy sat quiet, taking notes, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, but never losing his steady, unreadable gaze. Then, right before lunch recess, a sealed envelope changed the rhythm of everything. Kennedy's team handed the envelope to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. She read the contents silently, adjusted her glasses, then glanced at Kennedy's attorney. "You're calling this witness next?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. His reply was measured. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Julian Vega to the stand." The name didn't register with most people in the room. Even some of the reporters looked confused. But AOC didn't. For a brief moment, her expression cracked just a flicker. Her fingers twitched. Her posture stiffened. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was something close to recognition. Julian Vega. To most, just another name. But to those who knew her past, it rang louder than a fire alarm. Years ago, long before Congress, before the Green New Deal, for her first campaign, Julian Vega had been a grassroots organizer, just like AOC. They'd worked together in New York on housing rights and labor protests, but somewhere along the line, things had splintered. Badly, AOC had moved upward fast. Julian hadn't. Rumors of a falling out, accusations of abandonment, even moral disagreements about tactics had swirled quietly in activist circles. But none of it had ever gone public until now, and there he was, wearing a plain suit, no tie. Clean-shaven with a calm expression and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much, he walked up to the witness stand, swore in, and sat down, his presence commanding attention without asking for it. You could feel the air shift, as if everyone knew this wasn't just another testimony. This was the moment Kennedy had waited for. This was the card he held while everyone else played checkers. And the only question that remained was simple. What would Julian Vega say? Truth? The betrayal? Or something even AOC hadn't seen coming? Julian Vega adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and looked out across the courtroom, not with anger, not with pride. Just focus. Calm. As if he'd been waiting years for. This, Kennedy's attorney stepped forward with the kind of caution you reserve for explosives. "Mr. Vega," he began, "you've known Representative Ocasio-Cortez for some time, correct?" Julian nodded. Since before anyone knew her name, that alone turned heads. The attorney paced slowly. "And would you describe your work together as productive?" Julian gave a soft, almost sad smile. "At first, yes. We were fighting the same fight for tenants, for workers, for people who never get heard." The attorney nodded. But something changed. Julian leaned forward. Everything changed the moment cameras showed up. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Julian continued. No script, no hesitation. She used to organize for the people. Then she started organizing for the spotlight. AOC's lawyers immediately objected. Speculative, irrelevant, personal bias. But the judge held up a hand. "Mr. Vega," she said firmly, "stick to direct experiences." He nodded. The room quieted again. Then came the question that shifted the earth beneath their feet. Did Representative Ocasio-Cortez ever ask you to alter the facts of an event in order to create a more compelling public narrative? The room went still. No typing, no coughing, no movement. Julian blinked once. Then 9 words left his mouth. Yes. She said the truth wouldn't go viral. The silence after that wasn't just awkward, it was heavy. AOC didn't flinch, but her team did. One of her lawyers visibly exhaled through his nose. Her communications aide, seated in the back, reached for her phone with trembling fingers. Even the judge paused, as if she needed a moment to register. What had just been said? Kennedy sat stone still, hands folded. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to, because with 9 words, his witness had cracked open the foundation of AOC's case. This wasn't about one quote in a Senate hearing anymore. It was about character, credibility, intent. Julian wasn't ranting. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, measured, devastating. And the worst part for AOC, there was more. He wasn't done. Julian Vega hadn't come to grandstand. He didn't raise his voice, didn't insult or exaggerate. That made his words cut deeper because they felt real. He leaned slightly forward, hands clasped, voice even. The story she tells now, it's not the story we lived. Kennedy's attorney stood still, allowing the silence to linger. It was a rare kind of courtroom moment where the jury doesn't just hear the testimony, they feel it. Unrehearsed, undeniable. What exactly do you mean by that, Mr. Vega? The attorney asked softly. Julian took a breath. In 2016, we organized a rent strike. It was brutal. Tenants were terrified. Landlords were threatening families. We planned to document everything truthfully. No spin. But she had another idea. Paused. The judge watched closely. The jury leaned in. She said, and I quote, "We need a villain, or no one's going to care." Murmurs echoed through the gallery. She suggested we single out one landlord, the one who wasn't even the worst, and focus all media pressure on him, said it would humanize the story. What it really did was destroy a man's business and his family. AOC's lead counsel slammed his hand on the table. Objection. It's character assassination irrelevant to the case at hand. But Kennedy's attorney responded calmly, Your Honor, the plaintiff has built her case entirely on her reputation being harmed. The defense has a right to challenge the image she has constructed if it contradicts direct testimony from those who worked closest with her. The judge agreed. The objection was overruled. AOC's face didn't flinch, but to the trained eye something changed. Subtle clench of the jaw. A slow blink that lasted half a second too long. A chill that ran deeper than the courtroom AC. Kennedy still said nothing. This wasn't his moment. This was Julian's, and he wasn't finished. She started thinking more about press than policy. She'd show up late to meetings, but on time for cameras. When we asked her about it, she told us. He trailed off. His voice cracked slightly for the first time. She told us we were too small-minded to understand strategy. There it was. The divide. The fracture. The beginning of the split between the grassroots activist and the rising political icon. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath, because what Julian Vega was describing wasn't a single bad day or one moment of poor judgment. It was a pattern. A philosophy, and that mattered. Because AOC wasn't just suing John Kennedy over a quote, she was demanding the court uphold her image, her credibility, her legacy, and Kennedy had just shattered it by handing the mic to the one man who had seen it all before the world ever knew her name. By the time Julian Vega stepped down from direct examination, the courtroom had transformed. Jurors sat stiff in their chairs. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the judge looked unusually alert. But the real tension came when AOC's lead attorney stood up. He adjusted his tie, walked toward the witness box, and gave Julian a hard, rehearsed look, the kind you give someone you're planning to discredit. Piece by piece. Mr. Vega, he began, voice sharp, you claim to have worked closely with Representative Ocasio-Cortez, yet your name doesn't appear in any formal campaign records, public acknowledgments, or verified media archives related to her early political work. Why is that? Julian didn't blink. because I wasn't there for the spotlight. There before it, bold response, but one that opened him up. So you're telling this court that you're an invisible figure in her rise? And yet, you expect your testimony to outweigh documented history? Julian leaned back, unshaken. The truth doesn't need credit to be true.
Elta?
That line hit harder than expected. A few heads turned in the gallery. One juror even scribbled it down. The attorney tried another route. Mr. Vega, isn't it true that after your fallout with Miss Ocasio-Cortez, you attempted to run for local office yourself? Want? There it was, the attempt to paint him as bitter, resentful, a failed politician with a grudge. Julian paused, then nodded. Yes, I ran. I lost. And she never returned my calls after that. That's also true. The attorney smiled as if he'd caught something. Ah, so this testimony could be motivated by personal bitterness? Julian's next words, however, flipped the courtroom again. I have no bitterness toward her success. I'm proud of where she got. I'm just ashamed of how she got there. For a second, Evan AOC's own lawyer faltered. The jury didn't look away from Julian. Not anymore. And the attorney, grasping for ground, moved to discredit his claims further. Let's talk about that rent strike you referenced. You said she targeted a landlord unfairly. You have documentation of this? Or are we just relying on your memory? Julian reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The court clerk took it, passed it to the judge. It was a transcript, an old email. Dated, time-stamped, and printed from the original. Server, sent from AOC's old Gmail. The subject line. Media Narrative Strategy, March 2016, Rent Campaign, The Body. Make him the villain. Clean, simple, truth won't trend. This will. You could hear a pin drop. The judge raised an eyebrow. AOC's lawyer froze. Even the gallery collectively gasped, not for drama's sake, but because they all realized this wasn't just testimony anymore. This was evidence. Julian Vega didn't just bring memory. He brought proof. And the foundations of AOC's lawsuit were starting to crack not because of Kennedy's words, but because of her own. The document sat on the judge's bench like a ticking time bomb. Every word of that old email felt like a sledgehammer to AOC's carefully constructed image. This wasn't just an old misstep or out of context. Quote, this was strategic manipulation in her own words. From a time when no one was watching, the courtroom was silent, but the noise outside was deafening. The press room, down the hall, erupted. News anchors scrambled for live reactions. Is this the email that ends AOC's lawsuit and her public credibility? One reporter tweeted, it went viral in minutes. Inside, though, the focus was laser sharp. The judge cleared her throat and looked directly at AOC's counsel. Would the plaintiff like to challenge the authenticity of this document? Her lawyer hesitated. It's just long enough for everyone to notice. No, Your Honor, he finally said, voice tight. But we contend it's out of context. The judge nodded. Then the jury will decide the weight of it. The damage was already done. AOC, for the first time in the trial, looked genuinely tense. Her hands were clasped too tightly. Her gaze was fixed not on Julian, not on Kennedy, but on the jury. Watching them, reading them, she could tell the shift had happened. Her team moved fast. That afternoon, they called a PR consultant to the stand, trying to reframe her as a figure forced to play hardball in a cynical media world. Key talked about optics, strategy, and the way female politicians are scrutinized more harshly. It was a strong attempt, but it rang hollow compared to the simplicity of Julian's testimony. Kennedy never once rose to speak. His team didn't need a dramatic closing argument, not yet. The testimony and that one printed email was more powerful than any fiery speech. The jury began to see a new version of the case. AOC come to court accusing Kennedy of character assassination. But now the trial was exposing character itself. The contrast couldn't be clearer. AOC, once the symbol of authenticity, was now struggling to explain away her own words. Kennedy, often dismissed as a folksy provocateur, had quietly let a single witness do all the talking. It wasn't just about winning or losing the case anymore. It was about what people would remember after the verdict was read. And with every minute that passed, AOC's legacy, once bold, unshakable, and iconic, was now flickering. Not because of politics, but because of the truth never thought would surface. By the time the 8th day of trial arrived, the courtroom felt like a powder keg with a lit fuse. Public opinion was spiraling. News headlines once praising AOC's courage for filing the lawsuit now read with growing skepticism. Truth or strategy? AOC's words come back to haunt her. Kennedy's silent but effective did. A single witness flipped the case. Outside the courthouse, protesters had begun to splinter. Some still chanted her name, but others held up signs quoting Julian Vega's now infamous line, "Truth doesn't need credit to be true." Inside, AOC's team was in damage control mode. They called a longtime policy advisor to the stand, a woman who had worked with AOC since her first campaign. She was articulate, sharp, and clearly loyal. Her testimony was meant to re-establish AOC as a genuine reformer, someone who pushed boundaries not for personal gain, but to elevate voices no one else would. "She's passionate," the advisor said. "That passion sometimes makes her seem aggressive or calculated, but she never forgets why she ran for office. It was heartfelt." The jury listened. Well, but there was a lingering problem. Passion wasn't on trial. Credibility was. Then came the redirect. Julian Vega was allowed to be recalled briefly to clarify one key point. Kennedy's attorney asked him only one question. "Mr. Vega, do you believe Representative Ocasio-Cortez started out with good intentions?" Julian didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. She was brilliant, fearless, and honest." At first, he let the silence hold, but she traded the truth for attention. "That's not an opinion, it's a pattern." That single line hit harder than every cross-examination that followed. In response, AOC herself made a risky move. She stood. Her legal team objected, but she whispered, "Let me." She approached the bench and asked the judge for permission to make a voluntary statement before the court. The judge, surprised but intrigued, granted it. AOC stood in the center of the courtroom, facing the jury. Her voice was low, but deliberate. "I'm not perfect," she began. "Yes, I've made choices that prioritized impact. That's politics. That's survival. But I've never intended to deceive anyone." She looked toward Julian. "You saw my beginning, but you never saw what I was up against when the cameras came. It wasn't about going viral. It was about staying visible. Maybe I lost part of myself in that fight, but I never stopped fighting for what matters." It was honest, vulnerable, almost moving, but it wasn't enough, because the jury didn't just want intention. They wanted truth. And in a courtroom where every sentence could be fact-checked, where emails had surfaced and old allies had turned into reluctant truth-tellers, her words, however emotional, sounded more like a closing argument than a confession. And that's when everyone knew. No matter what the verdict would say in writing, the damage was already done. The final day of the trial didn't feel like a climax. It felt like a conclusion that had already been written in the minds of everyone watching. The jury deliberated for only a few hours, but it felt longer. Reporters lined the courthouse hallway, refreshing their feeds. Legal analysts filled the airwaves, speculating, dissecting, preparing the public for any outcome. Back in the courtroom, both legal teams sat still. AOC looked composed, again visibly rehearsed, but tired in the way only someone who'd taken too many public hits in too little time could be. Kennedy, still silent, still. Like a chess player who had moved the final piece 2 days ago and was now just waiting for everyone else to see the checkmate. The jury returned. The foreperson, middle-aged woman, with the look of someone who'd taken her civic duty far too seriously. Rosen read the verdict. In the matter of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez v. Senator John Kennedy, regarding charges of defamation, reputational harm, and intent to damage public image, we find in favor of the defendant. Soft gasp, a shuffle of feet, A pause. AOC nodded, no tears. Just the look of someone who knew this outcome was inevitable the moment Julian Vega spoke. But the real verdict? It wasn't written in the court documents. It lived in the headlines that followed, lived in the way people started to talk about her, not as a fighter, but as a figure who may have constructed more than just campaigns. Cable news didn't just say Kennedy wins lawsuit. They said, witness reveals cracks in AOC's story. Trial exposes how influence was built on optics. The email that changed everything. Julian Vega quietly exited the courthouse through a back door. No press, no attention. Just like how he came in. He'd never wanted the spotlight, only the truth and Senator John Kennedy. He stopped briefly outside the building, facing a wall of microphones. And when asked if he had any statement now that he'd won, he gave only one sentence. The truth showed up, and I didn't need to say a word. He tipped his head, turned, and walked off. No gloating, no grandstanding. Just victory delivered not by volume, but by silence. AOC left the courthouse minutes later. Her staff shielded her from cameras, but one image leaked anyway. Her alone. In the back seat of a black SUV, staring out the window, expression unreadable. In that one moment, people didn't see a political powerhouse. They didn't see a victim of a smear campaign. They saw something else entirely. They saw the cost of building a legacy on moments instead of truth. Days passed, then a week. And while the media churned through the aftermath of the verdict, something more permanent had taken root out. Not just about the case, not just about who won and who lost, but about the story people thought they knew. AOC returned to Capitol Hill. But something had changed. The same reporters who once sprinted to her post-hearing pressers now approached with caution. Supporters still showed up, but their questions were different now. Not how will you fight back, but what happened back then, and was any of it true? Late-night hosts softened their applause. Even her most loyal allies gave carefully worded statements, supportive. Yes, but with phrases like everyone makes mistakes and the pressure of public life is immense. And behind all the noise was one undeniable reality. Her voice no longer carried the same weight. The lawsuit she filed to protect her image had, unintentionally, pulled back the curtain. Not because Kennedy had targeted her. He never really tried. Not because the jury was biased, but because a single witness, someone from before the headlines, for the campaigns, told a truth that couldn't be spun. A truth that rang louder than any podium speech. Julian Vega disappeared back into the anonymity he never wanted to leave. No interviews, no book deals, just silence. And in that silence, he became something far more powerful than a critic. He became the mirror AOC had avoided for years. Senator Kennedy? He didn't ride the victory wave like others might have. In fact, in his next Senate appearance, when asked by a reporter if he felt vindicated, he simply said, I didn't want to hurt her, wanted the truth to breathe. And in a strange twist of irony, it was Kennedy's restraint, not his rhetoric, that elevated his standing in the public eye. Oak would continue her work. She would still speak, still vote, still fight. But something had fundamentally shifted. The next time she walked into a hearing room, the room didn't lean forward quite as eagerly. The spotlight still followed, but the trust didn't, because legacies aren't built on moments that trend. They're built on truth that stands, even when no one's looking. And in that courtroom, in just 9 seconds, one man reminded the world of that.